because I wasn't able to get a video out yesterday because PSN was giving me issues when I was actually trying to record here. So hopefully the stream is going up and I can talk to you guys about the 40-man roster and everything you need to know about it and how to manage it effectively in your franchise modes and everything like that in order to manage your team properly. Now, I assume that if you've played franchise mode, you know what the 40-man roster is, at least generally in concept, but I know a lot of people are a little bit confused on what the 40-man roster is and does, so I'm just going to break it down for you in, the simplest way possible, because it's really not that big of a deal. I mean, it's important, but it's not as complicated as some people might think it is. Now, the 40-man roster is obviously a 40-man roster, but what it is there can be players on it from any point in your organization. So you can have MLB players, AAA players, AA players, single A players on your 40-man roster. Now, what you'll see here on my breakdown for this franchise mode, if you look at the top right, there is a row for 40-man rosters. So you'll see injured list, waivers, 40-man, and where the 40-man roster is that gives you an idea of where your 40-man roster players are located. So it shows that I have 36 40-man roster players that are in the MLB and 4 40-man roster players that are in the AA. And that's reflected in here. If I scroll down, these are all MLB players until I get to the bottom. I have some AA level players that are technically on the 40-man roster. Now, the easiest way for me to put this, and the most simple way for me to put this, is the only way for a player to play on your MLB franchise or on your MLB level team is to be a part of your 40-man roster. And so that is where things come into play with the 40-man roster being really important. That's why I want to discuss this today, is because in order for a player to be on your 40-man roster, or in order for a player to play at the MLB level, they have to be on your 40-man roster. So let's say, because I have 40 men on my 40-man roster, I'm capped out. Let's say today I wanted to bring up Dominguez here to my MLB squad and I wanted to play him. I physically would not be able to bring him up to my 40-man roster. I would not be able to bring him to the MLB in order to actually play this player. So if I go ahead and I went and I hit... or no, he's on the 40-man roster. I apologize for that. If I wanted to bring up somebody that's not on the 40-man roster, I would not be able to do it. So say I want to bring up Bartolo Colon, I could hit move to MLB, but what it's going to tell you is that Bartolo Colon's not on the 40-man roster. He will need to be added before he can be moved to the MLB team, and this is why this is essential. So if I go ahead and hit add to the 40-man roster, I have a full 40-man roster, so in order to add Bartolo Colon, I would have to free up a space on my 40-man roster. And as it says here, this is going to give you the information you need to know in order to move somebody off of your 40-man roster. You would either need to designate a player for assignment, place a player on outright waivers, or place a player on unconditional release waivers. And essentially what all that means, I won't get into the specifics of each of those, but what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to put a player up for grabs for other MLB teams. So what I'll show you is if I wanted to move a player off of my 40-man roster, I would have to go ahead and designate them one way or another. And the tough part about that is when you have good players, like guys like Dominguez, who has a potential, they're not going to survive on waivers. They're going to be claimed up by another team. So say I wanted to go ahead and designate Bayron Lora in order to bring up somebody else, I would have to say, hey, I want to remove you from the 40-man roster. In order to remove him from the 40-man roster, you need to pass him through irrevocable waivers in order to continue with this move. Now that's the thing. So I can do that, or I believe I can hit designate for assignment, which is pretty much the same thing in terms of the actual effect of it. What it ends up doing is it allows somebody else to claim the player from you. So let's say I just went ahead and removed him from my 40-man roster. It would put him on waivers, and that would allow another team to claim him. So if you go over to your transactions, you'll go to pending transactions, and waiver requests. Bayron Lora will be on waiver requests here for a couple days until other teams have the chance to claim him. Now, more than likely, if you put a player on there with B or better potential, they're going to get claimed. If you put a player on there with a good overall, like 65, 70 overall, for like, a kind of a low overall player that is kind of a high overall player for the minor leagues, they will probably get claimed. So you want to be very aware of this. And this is why these things have become very important. Because most of the season, what's going to happen is for your 40-man roster, you're only going to be able to have 25 players up in the MLB. And right now it's showing different for me because it's showing down at the bottom of that, or sorry, if you look at the top right of the screen at that breakdown, what I'm looking at is the bottom row where it says active. So normally, as you can see in AAA and AA, it says a number of players out of 25. So I have 21 of 25 in AAA, 24 of 25 in AA, and 0 in single A. Well, normally for the MLB, that will say whatever number out of 25, and you're only allowed to have 25 players up in the MLB. And so the thing with it is that you can skirt around this. You have to call up and send down players that are on your 40-man roster. That's the only way to get around that 25-man roster limit for the majority of the season. And what that means is that, so right now I have a whole bunch of players called up because it's September, and I'll get into that in a minute. Essentially, a lot of these players have to stick down in AAA, and you don't have the option to call up certain players unless you're able to add them to your 40-man roster. And I know this will get a little bit repetitive, but basically what I'm saying is that you want to manage your 40-man roster in a specific way. So at the beginning of a season, or potentially the off season, heading into a new season, I don't know exactly when it happens, but you're going to have an option to designate which players are going to be on your 40-man roster. And heading into a new season, this is exactly what you want to do. You want to put on your top 25 players, your 25 players that you want to be on your MLB roster when you start the season. Those are the only players that you want to put on your 40-man roster. And here's why. Because through the course of the season, you don't know what your needs are going to be. You might have an injured pitcher, and so you might need to call up a AAA pitcher, or you might have an injured first baseman, or you might have an injured, like for my example here, I have Corey Dickerson who's injured. So at some point in the season, if he would have gotten injured earlier, I would have had to call up like Jason Martin, for example. And if I had my 40-man roster filled out to begin with, then I would be forced to stick with only the players that are on that 40-man roster, which can really hurt you if you don't do it correctly. So my number one tip whenever you're managing your 40-man roster is only put 25 players on your 40-man roster at the start of each season, because that'll fill out your major league roster until you hit September timeframe. Now, in between, you'll be able to add a couple guys to the 40-man roster where needed in order to call them up whenever you need to, but you want to leave space on your 40-man roster for as long as possible. Otherwise, what will happen is what just had to happen with me, where if I needed to call up a specific player right now, I'm not able to, because I've only got, I've got all 40-man slots filled, and then you go and you see that obviously one of my good potential players, a guy with B potential, is now on the waiver wire and can be claimed by another team. So you want to make sure that you try and keep your 40-man roster somewhere around 25 players. Unless it's for a specific need, then you can start to fill up your 40-man roster as the season goes on. And you'll start to see that you'll approach 40 men as the season progresses. Now, the other important thing to note about the 40-man roster, aside from the fact that you want to pay close attention to it, and you want to really focus on trying to keep that number down for as long as possible, that way you have room to call people up when necessary. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is that during spring training and during September, the month of September, the last month of the season, you're going to be able to have 40 men up in the MLB. And again, it can only be people from your 40-man roster, so you can have all of those players up that you want to have up. Now, a good example of this is right now here in this franchise. I'm obviously in September. I'm here on September 12th. And on my roster, what I decided to do is I decided to call up a lot of my AAA players, and I'll show you why. So in AA for my AA team is still playing in the playoffs. But a good example of what might happen to your team, my AAA team was eliminated. They had a record of 70 and 70, so they didn't play that well, and they didn't make it to playoffs. Now, an interesting thing about that is those players, I believe, will no longer progress because they're not playing games. So they would just be sitting there in AAA, kind of not serving any purpose. But what you can do, because it's September, is the roster expands to the full 40, and you can call up all of those 40 men for those players from the 40-man roster. Now, what you'll see on my team is the majority of those players were AAA players, and then I called a lot of my single-A players up to AA and AAA just to fill out those spots so they're not down in single-A. But I called up a majority of my AAA players because they're not in the playoffs, and I want to have them as utility players to fill roles if I need to give breaks to other players, and to just give them more experience, because they're not going to get any experience just sitting there in AAA. So what I did was I filled out my 40-man roster at that point, and then I brought up as many players as I felt I could use in the major leagues. And so at this point in the season, you're not going, because you're bringing up and you have access to all 40 of those players at once, you're not going to be kind of having to make a decision between one or another, or should I put this person on the 40-man roster or should I not? It's mostly going to be just call up your best players, bring them to the MLB, and utilize them in any way that you can. So that's not the way it is for the majority of the season, but for September, that's what you want to keep in mind, is that the 40-man roster expands and you want to be able to utilize it as such. Now, if you, for some reason, start off the season and designate the wrong players on the 40-man roster, and say the mistake that you do is what a lot of people do, is you don't realize really what the 40-man roster is, so you just put 40 guys on the roster and they're anybody, and say I trade for Michael Kopech, for example, who's my best prospect in all of the farm system for me. Well, he wasn't on the 40-man roster to begin with. I wouldn't be able to call him up if my 40-man roster was already full. So you want to keep spots open in case you make transactions like that, or you need a specific player to call up. You want to keep spots open for as long as possible so that you can do things like that, because you're going to be making trades and you're going to be calling players up and having injuries and everything like that. And so if I would have traded for Michael Kopech and I had my 40-man roster full, it would just kind of suck. At this point in the season, I wouldn't be able to use him, but I kept my 40-man roster down to somewhere around like 35 players, 30 or 35 players for the majority of the season, which is still a little bit high, but I would say around 30 players for the majority of the season. So I had a bunch of spots open once it came September, so I could call these players up. So what I did, called up Michael Kopech, Nick Kingham, Hernandez here, Mitch Keller, and then I called up other players that I think I could use a little bit, like Travis Swaggerty. And so I have all these players now up in the MLB, and I'm able to give them some real MLB playing time, give them a shot in the major leagues, and see if I'm good with them and see if they can perform at all. And so that's one of the really beneficial parts of the 40-man roster, is that here in September, you're able to really capitalize on the fact that you have all these players that you can call up. But you're only going to be able to do that, like I said, if you manage it properly. So make sure that at the beginning of the season, you only put 25 guys on your 40-man roster, and then only add guys to the 40-man roster as necessity demands. That's my big tip for you guys, is manage it properly. Don't load up your 40-man roster at the beginning of the year, because you're going to be making changes and you're going to want to be able to move guys back and forth, and you won't be able to do it. You won't be able to do it if you don't manage the 40-man roster properly. So it is really important. It's not as complicated as people might make it out to be. It's essentially just you have a 25-man MLB roster for the majority of the season, but you have 40 players to pull from in order to move players up to the MLB or not. You have 40 players that can play in the MLB, and then come September, you're able to have all 40 of those guys up in the MLB. And I'll show you a little bit of the impact of those things. So what you'll see is that I have this whole lineup here. Normally you'll see, 2 or 3, maybe 4 guys on your bench whenever you're doing this, but now I have, 5 extra guys on my bench that I can pull from and use in different situations. And all these guys are good at different things, and so I can try and get them real MLB action and trying to develop them. Delmonico, for example, is a good fielder, and I have access to a bunch of good fielding substitutions if I need them. Travis Swaggerty, likewise. And then you have guys with good bats like Delmonico. Did I say Delmonico for him? This is Delmonico. Martin is a good defender, and then you have good bats like Pedro Alvarez and Lonnie Chisenhall. And so now you have access to all these players. And then whenever I go ahead and look at my pitching rotation, my entire pitching rotation is filled out now. And I have access to all of these players, even extra players down here in my bullpen, 4 extra beyond what I can actually fit in the bullpen, that you have access to play, and it's really beneficial to you, and like I said, you'll only be able to use it if you manage the 40-man correctly. So hopefully this video helped you understand a little bit what the 40-man roster is about. Hopefully it kind of put things into perspective of what the 40-man roster really is all about, what it means, and the fact that it's really not that complicated. You just want to try and keep your 40-man roster not filled out for as long as possible, because you want to have some flexibility with it when you want to call players up. So if this video did help you guys out, if it gave you some insight into the 40-man roster, or how to manage your squad a little bit, please let me know by leaving a like on the video, subscribing to the channel, leave a comment down below, whatever it might be. Just leave me some feedback. I love to hear from you guys. We're getting close to 100 subscribers, so hopefully we can hit that goal and try and keep this channel growing. If there's any videos that you guys want to see next, anything you need specific tips on, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep these videos rolling. I apologize I didn't get a video up yesterday. That was just because PSN was giving me an issue like 3 or 4 times when I tried to stream it. So I said, you know what, screw it. We'll upload the video tomorrow. It'll be okay. So I apologize I didn't get one up yesterday, but here we are today. Hopefully it helped you guys out. If it did, like I said, give me some feedback. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.